Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this version of the What's Next Live podcast, where I have the absolute pleasure to welcome Colin Bryar to the show. My name's Tiffany Bova, and I have to say, when you reach out for sort of your dream guest, Colin is definitely one of them because his sort of experience as being the chief of staff for the amazing Jeff Bezos, the former, I guess, CEO, coming up here pretty quick of Amazon. I was just so thrilled that he said yes to join us. So welcome to the show, Colin.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on the show, Tiffany.
It's really a pleasure. But before we get started into the good stuff, I do something that I call bullish and bearish, and it's just an opportunity for us to get the juices flowing and have some fun with some fun questions. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
All right, the first one, bullish or bearish? Bullish, you're for it. Bearish, you're against it. First one, colonizing the moon. I'm not going to pick Mars, but let's colonize the moon. Bullish or bearish?
I'm going bullish on that one.
All right. Let's go with that. Okay. How about virtual reality e-commerce?
Bearish in the short term, I have to say.
All right.
Still ways to go, but I think we'll try it out. It'll take a little while to get going.
All right. Well, if anybody knows, I guess that your opinion probably will carry a little bit of weight. You might know a thing or two about e-commerce. All right. The third one, which is also sort of a little bit more fun, flying cars.
Oh, I'm definitely bullish on that.
All right, Colin. Well, thanks for playing with us. It's always just a fun way to get it started. But please, people who are joining us, everybody across the platforms, please share with us where you're joining us from and start posting your questions for Colin as we're going along. But this is meant to be super interactive. I'm just sort of the vehicle to bring questions to Colin today. But why don't we get started? I think, the first thing I'd say when I sort of describe the chief of staff as a role, people are a little confused as to what that actually means. And so, I'd love to start there, Colin. What does that mean being, an executive like Jeff Bezos's kind of right-hand chief of staff?
Well, so I did not know when he asked me, I just said, Andy Jassy is transitioning to a different role. And so I sat down and I asked him and I said, well, what does this role mean and what does success look like for you? And he said two things. One is, just helping him on a daily basis be a better CEO. A lot of it was making sure the right people and teams and issues get surfaced. And there's a lot of prep work and follow up on the bookends of the day that I did with teams to make sure that it was productive both for the teams and for Jeff. But then he said the second and more important thing was that by the end of this tenure in the role, that we'd be able to model each other's thinking. And so I would get a really good feel for how Jeff approached problems and would want to scale the company, because after that I would go somewhere else inside the company and operate independently. So at some companies, a chief of staff role is could be a longer term, and you're just there for the CEO. But this primarily was a training role to go somewhere else in the company. And so I got a great. I would always ask Jeff in the hallways, well, why were you doing this, or what were you thinking? And so it was a pretty fortunate spot to be in a very pivotal time for Amazon.
Well, so let's work on the book, kind of working backwards. I love the title, by the way, because I think a lot of was sort of work from the customer backwards. But I'd love to kind of begin with what the concept was of working backwards, because I'm going to guess it's broader than just that one statement.
Yes. So when my co-author Bill Carr and I, we get the question all the time: how does Amazon work? How do they operate? And it was hard to distill down into an elevator pitch. And we saw a lot of commentary from the outside looking in about bits and pieces of what Amazon was doing. And they were mostly focused on things like Amazon Prime, Echo, AWS, Amazon Web Services. But, those are outputs. And what we really wanted to do was, pull back the covers a bit and say, inside Amazon, how does it really work? Because what I mentioned, they're very different businesses, Prime, AWS, and devices and services and digital streaming. But they were all created using what Jeff has coined the invention machine, which is Amazon's 14 leadership principles, and then a set of 5 scalable, repeatable processes that Amazon used to create, start all these things from ideas on a whiteboard, essentially, to become very large household names and, tens of billions of dollars in revenue per year. So we wanted to really explain these for the next generation of business leaders, because the exciting thing is that these things don't only work for just $100 billion a quarter behemoth. They work for small organizations and large organizations. They work across a number of different industries. And so we really wanted to codify that to help the next generation of business leaders.
So maybe you could unpack those things, that kind of framework of those couple of 5 and 3, like where you really focused.
Yeah. So the first thing is just Amazon has 14 leadership principles, and which is more than most. They're not just posters on the wall. But what Amazon did is they really stitched and wove those principles into the basic, something that people do at the company every day, either hiring or developing new products. So it all starts from there. We encourage companies to get their own leadership principles, really think about them and codify them, because that's what makes companies unique. And that's also the first principles people can rely on when you're making those decisions when the CEO or the leader is not in the room. So you want to make sure those are very well understood. And then the 5 processes are, they're things that any growing company has to do, and challenges they face. Amazon just came up with different solutions, sometimes radically different solutions, and then sometimes building on the shoulders of those that came before us. And those 5 areas are hiring. Amazon has a very specific hiring process called the bar raiser process. How do you get people on board that reinforce your culture rather than, change your culture? And, it removes bias from there. It's a data-driven exercise to remove bias to try to get those people on who will reinforce your culture. And then the second process is what Amazon calls single-threaded leadership and separable teams. So, Amazon's grown quite a bit, obviously has 1.3 million employees, but, Jeff Bezos and his management team really thought about how do we organize ourselves internally so as we grow, we can remain nimble and, fast and also true to our roots. And a lot of that is single-threaded leadership. And then another process is just Amazon doesn't use slides to make decisions in meetings. They use narratives. So we go through that and talk about how it evolved and why that's important. And then the working backwards is a very specific process. It's the name of our book, but it's a very specific process on how Amazon takes an idea and then vets it with a group of people and decides whether to bring it forward to market. And, starting from the customer experience and working back from there. And then the last one is just how Amazon measures all of these businesses. And that, again, is, I would say, atypical. Amazon focuses inordinately on the input metrics, which are controllable input metrics. And those are the things that we define. If you do those things right, you'll have the desired, outcome in your business. And the output metrics are things like revenue, free cash flow, number of new customers. But if you can't really focus on those because you can't control those directly, you can control things like how many new products did we add to our catalog that we're ready to ship to customers in 2 days or less? Have we lowered our cost structure enough so we can afford to lower prices? Things like that. So we go through into detail and talk about those 5 processes plus how the leadership principles form so you can do those in your own organization.
Well, what I love about that is a couple of things, right? I think where, at least in my experience, where organizations get it wrong is I love the working backwards from the press release. Like, you didn't actually kind of use that word, but if you're going to launch something, like, write the press release, because what's the value to the customer? But then tying it all the way back in that single thread to kind of collaborate between multiple teams. But I think the Achilles heel where people get it wrong is in that metric, in that measurement, that it isn't something that tangibly people can see themselves aligning towards or working towards, and how their role plays a part in the overall success of that product or that group. Is that a fair assumption? Yes,
and it's also is indicative about, there's long-term thinking and customer obsession are part, some of the leadership principles, ownership and long-term thinking. And you can see those play out in particular in the metrics. if you were to go to an Amazon weekly business review for the e-commerce business, you would look through the metrics. The vast majority of them would be customer facing metrics. So they would answer the question, what did our customers experience last week? Was it better than the week before? Because Amazon knows if they relentlessly focus on improving those, customers will reward you, trust you more, and buy more eventually on the platform, and that in turn drives the revenue. And then in terms of the working backwards process, that is customer obsession at its heart. It starts with the question about the customer rather than a lot of companies use what's called the skills forward approach. What are we good at? What are our core competencies, and how can we nudge into an adjacent market? You can use a SWOT analysis. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But the word customer often isn't mentioned in those discussions. And so Amazon just inverted that and said, from the very beginning of the idea, we are going to keep the customer front and center, and we'll never forget that customer experience, define the problem, explain the solution to the customer. And if you don't like that press release, you don't move forward. The project doesn't get greenlit. You have to rewrite it again until you're comfortable that you have an idea, or that the idea is not worth pursuing right now, or maybe not big enough to pursue right now.
Well, I'm going to also guess you don't always get it right, which, we know that that's the case because it's not possible.
Yeah.
And so even though, right, you've gone through the process, you've worked backwards, you've got the press release, you think, okay, we're ready to go, we launch, and then it doesn't work.
Yeah, predicting consumer behavior is a very tricky thing to do. And it's meant this process, it's meant to reduce risk and increase your chances of hits. But if you don't have failures, it's a sign that you're probably not moving fast enough. So at Amazon, there's a decision-making framework called one-way or two-way doors. A one-way door is when you go through that door, it's really hard to reverse that decision. So where are you going to put a next fulfillment center, or where are you going to build the next airport? And this is Amazon doesn't do this in a city. That's a big decision. You sign some long-term commitments there. But launching other features, if it's a two-way door, you don't have to use that heavy decision-making framework. You can just go try it, and if it doesn't work, you go back out, the other side of that two-way door, and you try something different. But Amazon likes to make decisions with about 80% of the information that you really would want. So it's a little uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable dealing with ambiguity and knowing that you're going to make some mistakes some of the time. And so there are specific processes and about how you handle mistakes and how you can learn from them too. But mistakes, if you want to be an inventive company, you have to just accept that there will be some failures. It's not an experiment if you know it's going to work before you conduct the experiment.
Well, and how were the executives or leaders that maybe found themselves in that situation, right? Where kind of checked all the boxes in planning, it launches, and then 3, 6, 8, 10 months later, whatever your time frame is, or time horizon is, that you realize it is time to go back out the other side, maybe try it again, it isn't right, or completely eliminate it. What does that look like for a leader? And the reason I'm asking that is so many companies ask this question, like, how do I reward and measure failures? And more as a learning opportunity than shaming a leader, right, or a team. And so what did you guys do to actually make that feel like a safe place to try and fail?
Well, the first thing that you have to do is you have to be comfortable talking about your failures and, what were the mistakes that were made in front of as wide an audience as possible. And you do that, one, not only to learn and go, we use a technique borrowed from Toyota called the 5 whys, to figure out, you ask, well, why did this happen? And then you keep peeling back until you get to the root causes. But you want to learn so you don't make the mistake again. But you also want to shout it to a broad audience so they don't make the same mistake, so they can learn something too. There's something called a correction of errors report at Amazon. This would be more for if part of the website or service went down. It's a very clinical, in-depth correction of errors report where you say what happened and you identify the root causes. And then you say, here's what we're going to put in place so these defects don't travel downstream anymore and never happen again. So that's one type of failure. Another type of failure is something like the Fire Phone, where thought it was a good idea and it was worth trying, but it didn't work out. You have to know when you need to be stubborn and say, when do we do Fire Phone 2? Or to say, hey, we didn't get the first iteration right, but we're going to stick with it. An example of, so the Fire Phone, we just tried it and didn't do a Fire Phone 2, but for digital video in particular, there was a product that very few people probably remember. The first foray was called Amazon Unbox, where you could watch videos. It had to be on your computer, and it didn't take off with customers, but we didn't say, oh, we tried digital video, it's not working, so we'll move on to something else. It was a 7-year experiment that eventually became Prime Video and Amazon Studios. So you have to know when to be stubborn and stick with something and innovate on behalf of the customer and create a great experience. Or we tried it and it's, this isn't, we're going to move on and try something completely different.
Well, I think you've nailed it, right? One of the biggest things I feel and hear when I'm meeting with executives talking about this kind of change is what you just said. I'm in love with the status quo. What we're doing now is working, or we tried it in the past, it didn't work, which was just your example. And the other one that I, sort of did a lot of work in my own book is really about this. They just didn't give it enough time to take hold. Like they think that 30 days, 90 days, 6 months, depending on the product, that if it doesn't just take off, boom, let's kill it. Where, for anyone listening, I don't know if you caught that, right? But Prime and Studio, it was a 7-year journey. Now, mind you, Amazon has a big revenue engine that can afford to bankroll something a little bit longer than others. But what's the lesson in that, not pulling the plug too quickly and or hanging on and continuing to develop?
There are a couple lessons there. One is that you have to calibrate your level of investment to what you can afford. So the example with Prime, or with video, digital video, and then also digital music, those teams were relatively small, and Amazon could afford that investment over several years until it became big and it started to take off and gain traction. That's when you saw those the teams and the investment start to increase a lot more in terms of buying more original content, opening up Amazon Studios down in LA. But so you have to calibrate your investment there, I would say is one thing. And then one of the reasons we wrote the book is because we've seen a lot of common misconceptions about Amazon. Oh, well, they can afford to pump unlimited amount of money. Software engineers are jumping in the boat to join Amazon. You can get anything they want. It was hard to get resources at Amazon. You don't get extra points, bonus points for headcount. You get more scrutiny, if anything else. But long-term thinking, you have to allow these seeds time to grow and decide, and notice whether they'll become big businesses. But people think long-term thinking often takes you longer to get to your goal. But we've found that hasn't been the case. Long-term thinking actually more often than not can get you to your end goal faster. And the reason is because you're not zigzagging. You don't try something and stop that experiment before you learn something and then you zig or zag the other way. And so you're not getting to your end goal. Or if you're, you listen to pundits or analysts saying, here's what we need to do for to hit our quarterly goals. You're typically not creating a whole lot of value there. You may be bringing demand in from the future period into the current period, but it's a zero-sum game. You're in the same hole you were at the start of the next month or the next quarter. And two data points. Amazon was the fastest company from 0 to $100 billion in revenue, and then there was another company that went from 0 to $10 billion faster than Amazon did, and that was Amazon Web Services. As if you took that as a standalone company, and AWS did not have a bunch of tailwinds from Amazon, the company. They were very, very different businesses, very different customer sets. And so, but there was those both were built with long-term thinking in mind, and they grew very fast.
Excellent.
When measured,
yeah, we've got a couple questions from our listeners. So thank you guys for bringing them in. Here's the first one from Anthony. I wonder where most companies get customer first wrong. So where do you think companies get that customer first mentality wrong? And he says, I'd be willing to bet that most companies think of themselves that way, but just don't execute accordingly. I would agree, by the way, Anthony. But what do you think, Colin?
So there are two areas. One is in terms of how you measure things in existing businesses. You really need to, you have so many proxies between yourself and the customer. So you need to figure out ways to, at a very granular level, know what your customer experienced yesterday or last week, and to be able to tell that story. And the people need to internalize that. Amazon had a number of ways to do that, not only with metrics, but every 2 years you had to go be a customer service agent for a couple of days. You actually had to go work in the fulfillment center, so you got to see really how things worked. And even that's great for internal teams who are building tools for CS and the warehouse workers. The other thing is just how you vet ideas, and that is the working backwards approach is all about. You can't move forward until you've clearly defined the customer problem that you want to solve and the solution that you have. It's not, let's just try and launch a bunch of things, throw it out there and see what sticks. Because that's just, it often becomes more random noise. And so those are two areas where, and I think that's the difference between customer focus and customer obsession. So, there is that I learned the difference between those two at Amazon. We tried to put some examples there in the book.
Well, great. And I think you're right. I'm also a fan of customer centricity should never be at sort of the expense of the employees either, right? It has to be this kind of symbiotic relationship. All right, here's the next one. This one is from Harold Mann. How does this Amazon approach differ from how Apple chooses to listen or not listen to initial customer feedback? You don't have to talk about Apple specifically, but why do you think, just industry wide, it's a little bit different, unless you want to mention Apple specifically?
So, I can't really comment on specifically how Apple does it, just simply because I don't know. But, as a leader with any Amazon feature or product, you're expected to know it better than anyone else. And, part of it is talking with customers. Whenever I was managing businesses at Amazon, I would just read the customer feedback. I'd talk to customer service and reps and say, hey, what are the top issues you're facing this week? I'd look at both anecdotes as well as the data. And that was something that was a little surprising. The bigger Amazon got, the more focus it actually placed on anecdotes. And just, and those are real horror stories that you read in front of a group and say, we let customers down this way. And then you see if that matches with the data that you're collecting. And if they don't, you look at it with a skeptical eye and figure out which, where that broke down. So I think looking at both anecdotes and data is something that Amazon, they take both very seriously.
Yeah. So, I think that whenever people compare brands, I say, yes, obviously there's some commonality to very large brands, very well known, some of the best brands in the world. But also we have to make sure that we understand that the customer set may be different, and obviously maybe some of the same, and the job to be done, right? Or the pain point that you're trying to solve for the customer may be different. So replicating what other people do, and I often use Amazon as an example, like just replicating what Amazon does not mean you're going to just be wildly successful. I mean, you have to sort of put your own lens on it. Would you agree?
Yeah, a lot of these copycat strategies, if you say, I want to be the Amazon of X or the Apple of Y, they're probably best suited to be that. They just haven't gotten around to it yet. So you need to figure out what unique value you can add. And, a great example is we knew that Apple was going to be launching iTunes for Windows. It was the first time Apple ever built something for Windows. So it was a signal they were going all in on digital music. We did not come back after learning that and to try to put a copycat music service and have an iPod device and some software. We sat back and said, well, where can we add value? And as much as we would have liked to have done something, we had to look at our own capabilities at the time and said, we can't really add a whole lot at this day, to digital music. We're going to focus on books, right? Creating the digital book area because we have unique skills and we can make real progress for customers on that area. Where I think a lot of companies would say, let's get a fire drill project. We're going to slap something out that's, iTunes and iPod version 0.5, and Apple's already on version 2 by the time that thing gets launched. And that's another example of short-term thinking where that's a pretty big zig, where you, instead of marching to say, getting in this digital space, it's going to be many years, and we are going to methodically plod along and get to where we need to be for customers.
Well, there's so many references to Amazon in my book, but there's 2 quotes I often refer to pretty regularly. And it was the opening quote of one of the chapters of my book, which was said by Jeff Bezos, that, if we, and I'm paraphrasing, but if we have a good quarter today, it's because of decisions we made 2 years ago. And I think people miss that point, right? That they think in quarter, for the most part, you can make huge adjustments to either recover from a growth stall or put your foot on the gas on accelerating growth or whatever it may be. How did you frame that up, internally? Because I think that goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, right? A 2-year window, not all small businesses, anyway, can hold on that long potentially. So how do you reconcile that for companies who might be smaller?
It gets back to, you have to know what you can afford to invest. And, and if you get to the point where you're betting the company on something, that's just a risky endeavor. And, I would encourage you not to get to that choice, but, I would encourage you to place your smaller bets and earlier, so you don't get to the point where, if this doesn't work, we're going to run out of money. And one reason why is that you don't need too many bets to pay off that can have outsized returns that can pay for a lot of those smaller failures. But and the other thing is, I sound a bit like a broken record. If you focus on what is good for the customers in the long term, and you look at what resources you have to invest, it will work out more often than not, versus looking at what's the shiny new thing or what people say we should do in that quarter, because you're just wasting your scarce resources. They could be capital, they could be software engineering resources, whatever they happen to be, to work on a short-term thing that's not building long-term value for the customer. So I would say discipline, quite honestly, to stick with that, that philosophy and those principles, that customer obsession and long-term thinking will get you there faster, and it will get you there cheaper too, because you're not going to be wasting money on things that are off path.
Right.
And it's hard when you have all these people telling you, no, you should actually, you have to hit the number. You don't see at Amazon an executive pounding on the table saying, we have to hit our revenue quarter for this number. You may see them pounding their fist on the table saying, we did not add enough selection to the catalog as we should have. That was completely under our control. We made a mistake. How are we going to organize so we can increase selection or reduce delivery times, to where we need them to be? That's that's the difference between focusing on controllable inputs versus those output metrics.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, right? Because, one of the things that I'm a firm believer on is that a lot of the inability for companies to do what you just said is internal inertia, and not something that's happening on the outside. Now, mind you, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. It's a black swan event. It's a very unusual and disruptive. All things normal, not obviously what we're dealing with at the moment, that would be true. Where right now it's such an external, uncontrollable situation. You have very little you can do but figure out how do you remain relevant and consistent and deliver what your customers need today, so that you can obviously be there for them in the future. Yeah. And so the other thing that I want to cover off, there's sort of 2 more things. One is, and I use this often, is the fact that you don't use slides to present. And, for someone who lives and breathes slides, like I hope everybody starts to take that, to heart. But communicating and storytelling and galvanizing and inspiring, if you will, other people to really see the vision. That's a very unique skill. And so what happens internally to get people prepared potentially, because some of these executives have grown up giving presentations that way, and then now they show up, as you said, right? It has to sort of culturally be a fit, but how do they do it now going forward? What's that chasm they have to cross?
So the first thing is that it's harder to write an initial 6-page memo or narrative. That narratives mean 6-page memos typically at Amazon, and it forces the writer or the writing team to have just clarity of thought before they get in front of an audience. So you really have to get your argument and your story straight. And you can't do it the night before. Also, you need to write it, set it aside, show it to other people, and have a well thought out argument. And the whole point about narratives is to get as much information over to the people you're presenting in order to make a better decision. And so we realized, and it was in 2004, that we were using the wrong tool to make better decisions. And so that clarity of thought, just the pixel density, it's 7 to 9 times the pixel density. People read faster than they talk. You can handle multi-causal arguments better in a narrative than slides. In effect, what you're doing is you're giving the audience, and in this case, it's the reader, 10 times more information at least. And in the same unit of time. An hour time spent in a presentation is the same as an hour in a narrative meeting, but you just get so much more information. So you're increasing your chances of making a better decision. So that's why Amazon switched to them. And how these meetings work, they're kind of bizarre if you have never seen one before. People are chit-chatting, and then, if it's virtual, they'll say, okay, let's start. And then a document is circulated, or if you're in the room, it's passed out, and it's 20 minutes of silence where you're just reading the narrative, you're making your comments either online. And the nice thing about this, it also removes bias, because you're not listening to what the most senior person in the room is saying, because they haven't said anything yet. So you're adding your comments in, and sometimes great ideas come from unexpected places in the audience. And so you have 20 minutes of what's happening. Really, if you looked at it through different lenses, a massive amount of information is being transferred to the other group. And then you have a 40-minute really in-depth discussion on, if it's a decision-making forum, or if it's a working backwards as a type of, a narrative, a PR FAQ, you're having those high quality discussions, and you leave the room with a better product idea than you came in with. So that's how those meetings work. And to get started, you can look at some examples of great narratives, and then you can see where the quality bar is. That helps a lot. If you don't have those, you just get started, which is what we did at Amazon. And the first ones were not that good. I'm here to tell you. I read some of them, I wrote some of them, but you do get better. And it's the clarity of thought that really matters. It's not the flowery prose that matter.
Well, and I think there's so many lessons in what you just said, so I might challenge those that are watching, right, to not make it a 6-page, because I think that might be a little daunting out of the gate, but maybe it's a 1-page narrative. But I love the silence. I love the share the information, let everybody read it and absorb it, and then discuss it, and having this kind of open dialogue around the substance of what it is you're trying to actually accomplish. I think there's so much power in that. And I also hear that, in besides the 2 pizza rule, which I think is so famous, right? It's the kind of leave the chair empty at the head of the table for these big conversations as sort of representing the customer. I love that as well.
Yeah, anything you can do to remove bias and gather more data and whatever process, it really helps. In these presentation meetings, afterwards, if someone asks, well, how did the meeting go? You typically, if it's a slide presentation, you say, oh, the presenter was great. It was really engaging. Or this presenter was really boring and I couldn't wait for the meeting to end. At the end of the day, customers don't actually care how your meeting went. They care that you made the right decision in order to build a product that's going to make their lives better. And so, that you need to organize, and that's the difference about organizing around for your customer and your customer's convenience, not your own convenience, to say, well, it's easier to write a slide and give a presentation than it is to spend a couple of days writing a narrative. And if you have a 30-minute meeting, it's a 3-page narrative, or you start with 1 page. That is a good idea too. We have 1-pagers that we used at Amazon too, and that the 1-page press release is a great example. everyone knows what a good press release looks like, and everyone knows after reading a press release whether they would buy the product or not. So use that, just start using that to figure out, is this a product that's worthy of developing?
Well, as we start to, wrap this up, we've got one more question here coming in. Let's share it. It's from Summer. Do you encounter fear to change in thread leadership? How does Amazon counter fear to ambiguity?
Fear to change.
Fear to change in thread leadership.
Well, I think that Amazon, is a comment like moving around to different areas. So Amazon does encourage that, and rotating leaders. And if you look at some of Steve Kessel, for instance, started the digital group, and devices was a big part of that. He knew nothing about building devices, but he was well steeped in the Amazon principles and culture. So I think that figuring out what makes your company special and how you make decisions, and having someone who knows that well, and then moving them into a different area, you can pick up a lot of these functional skills or later on. And some of the best leaders at Amazon have moved around in several different areas, and I think they're better for it. So it takes a little while to get used to a new situation, but it works out pretty well. As a company, you build up bench strength too.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really critical, right? It's giving everybody the opportunity, going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, right? Try it, fail, learn, keep going, getting better at the 1 page, the 2 page, the 6 page, how to do the presentation, right? How to write the press release, like how to engage with other groups. I mean, I think all of this, especially over the last year, in wrapping this up, what has been the most surprising to you from, I guess, when you began, at Amazon, to the decision to sort of write the book and move on? Like, what was the most surprising thing to you? And I know that's a hard thing to sort of put your thumb on, because you say, oh, there's probably 100 things, but what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say, what was the most surprising thing to you, that you thought it was going to be this and it was so not, it was much more that?
Well, I think one of the most surprising things, and I honestly did not pop out as crystal clear until after or during the writing of the book, was, the Amazon has built some phenomenal products and services that, really, I think, make customers' lives better. But I think one of the legacies that will last as long or longer is this, what Jeff termed this invention machine. It's advances in management science on how to build and operate organizations. And that is something that's super useful for a number of different organizations. These hockey pucks and cylinders we have in our kitchen that we talk to right now, we're going to laugh at how primitive they are sometime soon. I don't know if it's next year or 2 years from now, but what Amazon has created with this, how do you build a long-term thinking, customer obsessed, inventive company that really takes pride in the operational excellence in what it does, to build something you can be proud to tell your grandkids about. I think that was the surprising thing to me, is that in itself is probably one of Amazon's most enduring legacies.
Well, I could keep going, but in respect of everybody's time, like, I'd keep going and going and going, because I have so many things I'd love to talk to you about. But we've had people join us from Toronto and London and Florida and California and Senegal. It has just been amazing. Thank you to everybody joining, for all the questions that we had. Colin, for your wonderful willingness to share, working backwards with all of us, and your experiences at Amazon. I think everybody could take away a little something, no matter if you're an entrepreneur, startup, mid-sized business, large. There's only a handful that are as big as Amazon, but I think there's lots of lessons to be learned. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for joining me on the What's Next podcast. And what parting words would you like to share with everybody, except for obviously read the book, which is in the top right, besides that?
Well, especially if you're a small organization, put the effort in up front to define who you are and how you make decisions, because and then how you bring people on board to reinforce that. When we've seen a lot of organizations grow from 5 to 10 or 10 to 100, and they say it's not like it used to be, it's usually because you haven't really codified exactly your decision, your principles, and then figure out how to bring in people who reinforce that. Because otherwise, you're going to get a culture, whether as you grow. It's just, will it be the one that you want? And you have to put some deliberate work into that.
And I think the keep it day one, always stay focused on that is, a thread that I think everyone refers to. So again, Colin, thank you so much for your willingness to share your wonderful insights with us and some of the great findings from working backwards. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe. And make sure you pick up a copy of Working Backwards, I guess, on Amazon.com.
Anywhere, any bookstore is fine. No, there are more places than just Amazon too.
All right, great. Thank you, Colin.
All right, thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, everyone.